As Keanu is playing live on Jimmy's show, a trembling voice from the crowd shouts out a memory only he could recognize, freezing him mid-song and turning the studio silent. Jimmy Fallon's stunned reaction says it all as the fun segment suddenly becomes an emotional, once-in-a-lifetime moment that no one in the audience will ever forget. I still remember the night the whole studio forgot it was just a TV show. It started like any other episode of The Tonight Show, but by the end, even the cameras felt like they were just witnesses to something deeply human. Backstage, Keanu Reeves sat on a high metal stool, a black guitar resting across his lap. He was rolling the pick between his fingers, half listening to the muffled roar of the crowd through the walls. Crew members hurried past, lights flashed, someone called out timestamps, but he moved slowly, gently, as if he didn't want to disturb anyone. He thanked the sound guy twice, smiled at the nervous intern who tripped over a cable, and kept asking people how they were doing instead of talking about himself. On paper, it was just another promo stop. Play a little guitar, share a funny story, shake hands, go home. Inside, though, he felt that familiar weight in his chest, the quiet sadness he had learned to carry without letting it harden him. Across the building, standing in the long, buzzing line of audience members, a young woman named Alina wiped her damp palms on her jeans for the 5th time. To everybody around her, it was a fun night out in New York City. Late-night TV, bright lights, maybe a quick shot on camera if they were lucky. For her, it was the culmination of 11 years of waiting for a chance that felt both impossible and necessary. Tucked inside her jacket was a folded, fading piece of paper, a hospital wristband wrapped around an old movie ticket, both signed with the same clumsy black marker signature, Keanu, with hope. She could still hear the beeping machines, still smell the antiseptic, still feel the way his hand had squeezed hers when doctors weren't sure she would walk again. Back then, she had been 16 and broken in more ways than the doctors could see. A car crash on a rainy night had taken her best friend and left Alina staring at the ceiling of a hospital room, drowning in guilt she didn't know how to live with. Keanu had been visiting the ward quietly, away from cameras, just a tired actor slipping into rooms to sit with kids who felt like their lives were ending before they'd really begun. He had listened, really listened, while she described the screaming breaks and the way everything went silent afterward. When she told him she didn't deserve to be alive, his eyes had filled with a soft, aching sadness. "The world needs you here," he'd said, squeezing that hospital wristband. "One day you'll understand why. Please don't give up before you find out." Then he'd signed the band and the ticket from the movie she'd been on her way to see that night. She'd kept them ever since, like proof that someone believed in a future she could not yet see. Now, years later, the Tonight Show producers had read her email, the story she'd typed at 2:00 a.m. when she couldn't sleep, and called her back. They had listened in stunned silence as she explained how that one sentence from a stranger had pushed her to fight through rehab, to go back to school, to become a physical therapist who now coached kids through their own pain. The plan was simple and wild at the same time. She would sit in the audience as if she were just another fan, and at the right moment she would stand up and call out the exact words Keanu had said to her in that hospital room. No one knew if he'd remember. No one knew what it would do to him, or to her, if he did. Down on the studio floor, Jimmy Fallon leaned over the glossy wooden desk as the director finished explaining the surprise. Jimmy loved chaos in small doses, games, sketches, dumb jokes, but this was different. This wasn't a prank or a bit. This was a real human moment loaded into the middle of a carefully timed show. He looked through the pages of the rundown, then back at the director. "So after he finishes the guitar solo, we go to audience cam. She stands up and..." He let the sentence hang there, feeling the risk. What if Keanu froze? What if Alina broke down? Then he pictured the email again the way she said, "I just want him to know I kept my promise to live." Jimmy swallowed, nodded, and said, "Okay, let's do it, but we protect them. If either of them looks overwhelmed, we cut to commercial. No hesitation." The band struck up the warm-up music, bright brass exploding through the room as the audience poured into their seats. Alina found herself near the front, every light brighter than she'd imagined, every sound amplified. The floor vibrated beneath her sneakers. A comedian hyped the crowd, teaching them when to cheer, when to clap. Alina tried to breathe the way she had taught her own patients, slow in, slower out, but her heart refused to obey. On the other side of the curtain, Keanu rolled his shoulders and tried to shake off the fatigue from the long press tour. He reminded himself of the same simple rule he always used. Be kind, be present, don't pretend you're above anyone just because they're looking at you. Cameras went live. Jimmy's monologue flew by in a whirl of jokes and applause. Alina watched him, but her eyes kept drifting to the edge of the curtain where she knew Keanu would appear. When Jimmy finally said his name, the audience exploded. Keanu walked out with that slightly shy half-smile, black guitar slung over his shoulder like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. He hugged Jimmy, waved awkwardly at the crowd, and bowed his head in thanks as if they'd just done him a favor by screaming for him. He cracked a couple of quiet jokes, laughed at himself when he stumbled over a word, and for a moment Alina forgot to be nervous, just happy to see the man who had once looked at her like her life mattered. They moved into the music segment, the part the producers had circled in red. "All right, man," Jimmy grinned, turning to Keanu. "We've heard the stories, now let's hear the guitar." The lights dimmed, the band dropped into a low groove, and Keanu stepped up with a seriousness that felt almost out of place on a comedy show. He closed his eyes and began to play raw, unpolished, full of the rough edges most people hide in a polished performance. Each note seemed to drag pieces of his past into the room. The long nights, the losses, the way he'd kept going, not because life got easier, but because he decided to keep showing up anyway. As the solo built, the director gave a tiny signal. A camera pivoted toward the audience. Jimmy glanced toward Alina's row, then back at Keanu, a flicker of anticipation crossing his face. Alina's fingers tightened around the faded wristband under her jacket. Her throat burned. This was the moment. She rose slowly to her feet, legs trembling, the hot white of the studio lights dropping onto her like a spotlight she wasn't sure she deserved. Keanu's last note hung in the air, vibrating in the silence between him and the crowd. Before the applause could erupt, before Jimmy could say a word, Alina drew in a shaking breath and opened her mouth to speak, unaware that the next sentence would hit Keanu like a collision with the past and leave Jimmy staring in stunned silence, wondering if they had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Alina's voice cracked the silence before the applause could swallow the room. "The world needs you here," she called out, chest shaking, eyes locked on the man with the guitar. "One day you'll understand why. Please, don't give up before you find out." The sentence hit the air like a physical thing. Keanu's fingers froze on the strings. The last note he'd played kept ringing, thin and lonely, then faded into a silence that felt deeper than any punchline or cue. For a heartbeat, he looked confused, as if someone had whispered his own thoughts out loud. Then something in his face shifted. His gaze swept the crowd, searching, and landed on Alina standing there with both hands clenched at her sides, tears already spilling down. In the control room, a producer's hand went straight to the button that would send them to commercial. Jimmy half rose from his chair, catching the movement in the corner of his eye. He gave the slightest shake of his head, hardly more than a twitch, and the director hesitated. Cameras kept rolling. Nobody breathed. It was no longer a show. It was a room full of strangers waiting to see what one man would do with a memory he hadn't expected to face. Keanu set the guitar gently on the stand, as if dropping it too fast might break the moment. He stepped away from the mic, eyes never leaving Alina. He squinted not in the way a star studies a fan, but the way someone studies a ghost. Lines of recognition started to pull at his expression. "Hospital," he said softly, still off mic. Jimmy, sensing the importance, pushed his own microphone toward him. "Were you in Providence, Children's Ward, room 406? The numbers sounded like they were being dragged out of a locked drawer. Alina nodded, her whole body trembling now. "I was 16. You sat next to my bed for an hour when everyone else thought I was asleep." She fumbled inside her jacket with shaking hands and pulled out the crumpled hospital wristband, the ink faded but still visible under the lights. "You signed this. You told me those exact words when I said I didn't know if I wanted to live." The camera zoomed in. Millions of people at home saw his name next to the old movie ticket tied to that thin strip of plastic. But in the studio, it felt like only the three of them existed. A wave of memory washed over him. White corridors, the smell of disinfectant, the way a broken teenager had stared at the ceiling because looking anyone in the eye hurt too much. Back then, he had been carrying his own grief like a shadow that never left. He had said those words to her because he needed someone to say them to him, and he hadn't known where else to put them. Now here she was, standing and breathing and shaking but alive, proof that something he'd almost forgotten had actually mattered. The crowd stayed strangely quiet, as if the entire audience had agreed without speaking that laughter would be wrong here. Jimmy's eyes glistened, but he stayed back, letting whatever this was unfold. He could feel the risk the way performers sense a bad fall coming, but there was also something else underneath, hope, raw and unplanned. Alina looked down at the band, then back up at him. I promised myself that if I made it, if I ever figured out why the world needed me, I'd find you and tell you. She took a shaky breath, her voice dropping low. Tonight, I finally know, and I'm here to thank you, but that's not the only reason I came. Keanu stepped down from the stage, ignoring the tangle of cables and the uncertain hands of crew members reaching out to guide him. He crossed the space between them slowly, as if every step had to pass through 11 years of distance. When he reached her row, the audience parted without being asked. Alina's legs almost gave out when he stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could see the tiny scars on his knuckles, the way his throat worked as he swallowed. Can I? He started, voice rough, then opened his arms slightly. She nodded before he could finish, and they fell into an awkward, tight hug. It wasn't glamorous or staged. It was two people clinging to a shared moment neither of them had known they needed this much. The crowd erupted in soft applause that faded quickly, like they understood it wasn't a victory lap, just a deep breath after a long swim. When they pulled apart, Jimmy called gently from the desk, Alina, if you're okay with it, can you tell us the rest? His tone had none of his usual bounce. It was careful, like someone easing open a door that might slam shut at any second. She nodded, wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, and turned toward the nearest camera, but kept her gaze mostly on Keanu, as if talking only to him. After the crash, she said, they told me I might never walk without help. I lost my best friend that night. I thought it was my fault. I kept replaying all the little choices, the road we took, the joke I told that made her look at me instead of the street. I didn't want to be in my own body or my own head. Her voice shook, but there was a steady core under it now. Your words didn't magically fix anything. I still cried, I still screamed at people who were trying to help me. But every time I thought about giving up, I heard you. Don't quit before you find out why you're here. I decided, one tiny day at a time, not to quit. She glanced down at her legs, at the faint line of an old scar peeking over her shoe. I worked harder in rehab than I've ever worked on anything. I fell so many times I lost count. I failed exams. I dropped out of college once and went back, but I kept this. She held up the band again, as proof that someone believed there was a reason I was still alive. Now I'm a physical therapist. I help kids learn to walk again. I sit with them when they say the same words I once said. And I tell them what you told me. Keanu's eyes shone, his jaw clenched as he fought to keep his composure. Around them, people sniffled, wiped at their faces without embarrassment. Even the cameraman closest to them had tears pooling at the edge of his vision, his focus a little softer than usual. It was kindness looping through time and coming back to face its starting point, bigger than when it left. Alina took another breath, this one steadier. But that's not all, she continued, because in my group there's someone who reminds me way too much of who I used to be. She turned slightly and gestured to the end of her row. The camera swung to follow her hand, revealing a boy around 13, a cast on one arm, a thin scar along his jaw. His hoodie was pulled up like armor, eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders stiff with the effort of holding everything in. This is Mateo, she said gently. He lost his brother in an accident last year. He thinks it should have been him. He used to love your movies. Now he barely talks in our sessions. He only agreed to come tonight because he thought it would be fun to see you play guitar. She looked at the boy. I'm sorry, Mateo. I know I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but you asked me once if the pain ever really changes. I thought maybe you should hear from the man who helped change mine. The entire studio seemed to lean toward that one kid, the way a crowd leans in to catch a whisper. Jimmy stayed absolutely still, fingers wrapped around his mug, knuckles white. In the control room, someone whispered, "We can't put a child on the spot like this." And someone else whispered back, "He's already here. Just let them talk." On the floor, a stagehand pressed a wireless microphone into Keanu's hand without waiting for instructions. Keanu turned to Mateo and crouched down so they were almost eye to eye. He held the mic low, not shoving it in the boy's face. "Hey," he said softly, voice carrying just enough for the room, "only if you want to, man. You don't have to say anything." Mateo's fingers twisted the edge of his hoodie. For a long moment, it seemed like he might stay silent and the moment would drift away, too fragile to hold. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, he lifted his head and spoke into the space between them. I don't want to be here anymore, he whispered, not just meaning the show, but something much darker and bigger, and the words floated into the microphones and out across the world before anyone could stop them. The sentence cracked straight through the studio, clean and devastating. There was no nervous laugh to cover it, no clever camera cut. People in the audience shifted, some reaching for the hands of the strangers next to them without even realizing it. Jimmy's heart slammed hard enough that he could hear it in his own ears. Every instinct as a performer told him to move, to speak, to soften. Every instinct as a human being told him to stay absolutely still. Keanu didn't flinch away from the boys' words. He let them land. He let them exist. Then he did something the show hadn't planned for, something no producer could script. He sank all the way down, sitting cross-legged in the narrow aisle beside Mateo's seat, guitar strap still across his shoulder, expensive suit wrinkling without a second thought. Suddenly, the star and the kid were the same height, both small shapes in a huge room. I'm really glad you said that out loud, he answered quietly. His voice stayed calm, but there was a tremor in it that matched the boy's. I've felt that way too, more than once, when people I loved died and the world kept spinning like nothing had happened, when I woke up and didn't recognize my own life. The crowd held its breath. This wasn't the glossy version of his story they were used to. This was the hurt underneath the headlines. He kept going, careful with every word. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist, I'm just a guy who's been sad and angry and tired and who was lucky enough to have some very kind people sit with me and remind me I wasn't alone. He glanced at Alina, then back to Mateo. It's okay to feel what you feel. It's also okay to get help with it, real help. Grown-ups, professionals, people like Alina here who know what they're doing. You don't have to carry this by yourself, man. You're not supposed to. Mateo's eyes glistened. It hurts all the time, he whispered. Everyone keeps saying it'll get better, but they don't know what it's like. His voice cracked on the last word. Alina's hand hovered near his shoulder, waiting for any sign he'd accept it. When he didn't pull away, she rested it there, gentle and solid. You're right, Keanu said. They don't know exactly what it's like for you, but this pain, it's not a punishment, it's a wound. Wounds are supposed to be treated, not hidden. He turned slightly toward the cameras, as if speaking to some invisible row of kids at home as well. If you feel like Mateo does, please tell someone you trust. There are people whose whole job in life is to listen and help you through it. You deserve that help. The room stayed quiet in a way that didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of fear, of love, of people silently promising themselves they would call their kids or their friends when the show ended. Jimmy swallowed the lump in his throat and let the cameras linger on this small circle of three: actor, therapist, boy, connected by something heavier than any stunt. Then, because the human heart can only hold so much raw pain at once, a different kind of energy started to rise. Not denial, not distraction, but the urge to lift, even just a little. Jimmy sensed it first. Hey, Mateo, he said, his voice still soft but carrying a thread of his usual spark. Alina told us you used to love music. That true? The boy shrugged, but his shoulders loosened a fraction. I used to play guitar with my brother, he admitted. We were terrible. A few people laughed, not at him, but with him, grateful for the tiny touch of humor. It didn't break the spell, it deepened it. Keanu's mouth tugged into a small, real smile. Man, so am I, he said. You heard that solo, I hit like 6 wrong notes. The crowd chuckled again, softer this time. You wanna hit a couple wrong ones with me? He slid the guitar strap off his shoulder and held the instrument out like an invitation instead of a trophy. No pressure, we can stay right here if you want. I can bring it to you. Mateo looked at the guitar like it was something dangerous and holy all at once. His casted arm made everything feel clumsy, and the idea of standing up in front of all these people seemed impossible. But Alina's hand was still on his shoulder, warm and steady. Keanu waited without hurrying him. Jimmy, sensing the fragile courage forming, started a soft chant under his breath. Mateo, Mateo, letting it grow only as much as the boy seemed able to handle. Soon the whole audience joined in, not like a stadium, but like a group of friends cheering one of their own. Very slowly, Mateo pushed himself to his feet. The sound engineer hurried over with the smallest, shortest cable they had. A crew member appeared out of nowhere with a stool at center stage. setting it up like they were building a tiny island for him. With Alina guiding his steps and Keanu walking just ahead, holding the guitar, they made their way toward the lights together. Under the glare of the stage, the boy sat, breathing hard, eyes wide. Keanu placed the guitar in his lap, adjusted the strap so it wouldn't press against his cast, and guided his uninjured hand to the strings. "No right way to do this," he murmured. "Just hit it. Let it be messy. Life's messy anyway." Mateo swallowed, took a breath so deep it seemed to pull the whole room into his lungs, and brought his hand down in an awkward, uneven strum. The sound that came out was scratchy and wrong and beautiful. The crowd cheered like it was the greatest solo they'd ever heard. Mateo's lips twitched, then curled into the smallest, shyest smile. A single tear slid down his cheek and landed on the guitar's worn black finish. Keanu laid his hand over Mateo's on the strings, looked him right in the eyes, and gave a firm nod, as if to say, "You did it. You're still here." And as that rough, imperfect chord vibrated through the studio, none of us knew yet that this would be the night people would replay whenever they needed proof that a simple act of courage, even just standing up and playing one bad note, could start to bend a life away from the edge.